Hello and welcome to Ihbc at COP26. Conserving buildings and places conserves our planet. Today we're welcomed by Roy Lewis and Crispin Edwards. Roy is a chartered town planner with a specialism in urban design and conservation of the historic environment. He has 40 years professional experience of planning and conservation work in the public, private, and educational sectors, and has been a full member of the Royal Town Planning Institute since 1980 and the Institute of Historic Building Conservation since its formation in 1997. He has a master's degree in architectural conservation, sits on the East Midlands Branch Committee of the IHBC, and is the Institute's policy secretary at national level. Recently retired from full-time planning work as a director and partner of Grover Lewis Associates Limited, he continues to take on a limited number of commissions of interest, including the field of appeal work and court actions related to town planning cases, where he has experience of acting as an expert witness. And Crispin is a listing advisor with Historic England, assessing his heritage assets for inclusion on the National Heritage List for England, principally under the regimes of listing, scheduling, and registration. After graduating in tourism studies, Crispin worked for the Heritage Trust for the Northwest, establishing Slaidburn Heritage Centre in Lancashire in 1999. He then worked for English Heritage and gained distinction in a postgraduate certificate in the archaeology of standing buildings before becoming Stockport's conservation officer. He has been a full member of the IHBC since 2012, represents the Northwest branch on the national board, and is the vice chair for the Northwest branch. In 2020, he gained the NOCN Level 3 Award in Energy Efficiency Measures for older and traditional buildings, and he convenes the IHBC's Green Panel, which provides the policy committee with comments and advice on sustainability matters. Well, welcome both Roy and Crispin. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Hi, thanks very much.
So I'd like to start off by asking you both to tell us a little bit about yourselves, how you got started, and why you're passionate about sustainability and conservation.
Shall I start? Roy here. Well, I started working in an architect's office in the early 1970s, and I decided to do a degree in town planning. And since graduating, I've been a local government planning officer, I've been a conservation officer, an access officer. I've acted as the course leader for an architectural conservation degree, and I've been a private sector planning and built heritage consultant. I think I've always been passionate about the quality of the built environment. And as far as I can see a high quality place, it requires not just good buildings, but it requires good townscape, good places as a whole. And I think in terms of design, that requires designers to appreciate the context of any proposed development. And the context of places invariably has a historic dimension. Conservation in particular, where I see it, conservation involves deciding, first of all, what you're going to keep from the present for the future. And secondly, the more difficult bit is how to do it. And that often involves adaptation and design and alteration, etc. And that's why design is integral to conservation. Sustainability, well, that's clearly the overriding highest priority issue that the world faces. Consequently, all design decisions have to give the highest regard to sustainability. It's an integral part of good design.
Yeah, that's true, Roy. My parents were both involved in archaeology, my dad on a professional level and my mum more in sort of amateur research. And as a family, we always visited lots of historic places. So I was always kind of passionate about heritage, and from quite an early age wanted to be involved in managing it and looking after it. The kind of big boost to my career came when I got an administrative role for English Heritage, because working alongside their experts gave me so much insight and understanding, and then that facilitated me doing the formal training that eventually led to me becoming a conservation officer. And it was particularly as a conservation officer that I got really interested in sustainability, because a lot of the work I did involved people wanting to improve their houses, particularly thermal improvements, notably windows, but also other things as well. And in order to give them proper advice, I had to kind of come to fully understand the issues myself. So it was really through that kind of dealing with practical inquiries and giving people the best advice on what sustainability really means is ripping out all of your windows and replacing them actually the most sustainable thing to do.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. Now, I know both of you were quite instrumental in drafting the Ihbc position statement on sustainability and conservation. So I'd like to ask you, there's a lot in that document. There's a lot of good stuff in that document. But what's really the headline argument that you're making there?
Well, the headline argument is that conservation of the historic environment is an inherently sustainable activity. It's an essential component of responding to the threat posed by climate change. Sustainability it includes conservation of the built and natural environment. It's not just about reducing carbon emissions.
Yeah, I think if I can add though, the statement doesn't just sort of say everything about conservation is marvellous and it's inherently, it all contributes. It is actually a balanced statement. The statement acknowledges the historic buildings and places aren't always perfect with regard to things like thermal efficiency. And there is often scope to improve their performance, both by repair and by adaptations, provided they're conceived with sensitivity and actually understanding of the significance of the building and how the building works technically. I think the key thing there is that the statement pushes is that buildings need to be looked at holistically. You can't just look at sort of one element and say, oh, well, we'll improve the windows or we'll improve the heating or whatever, or change the means of heating or whatever it is. You've got to look at the building holistically, how it works. You've got to look at how it performs. You've got to look at historic fabric. You've got to look at the architectural issues. You know, if you've got a building that's got very plain interiors, then it's not usually that difficult to do, say, dry lining of an interior. And put insulation in. If you've got an interior that's very significant, it's got a lot of architectural embellishments internally, then it's much more difficult. You know, you'd be covering all that up if you were to just simply apply insulation. So each building's different, and you've got to understand the character, the appearance, the significance of the building, and you've got to try to optimize its medium to long-term performance. But the statement signals really that in reality, most buildings can be made much more energy efficient. It just needs to be done with sensitivity and understanding.
Right, and talking about the sort of energy and carbon, you know, when you're talking about interventions and whether or not to do certain interventions, I think it seems to me there's a bit of confusion around embodied carbon and sort of what it means, especially with respect to existing buildings and potential interventions. How do you go about thinking about this issue or sort of explaining this issue?
Yeah, that's something we deal with quite a lot. Embodied carbon is basically a kind of shorthand for embodied energy, I suppose. Everything takes energy to make, and if you've got an existing building, a certain amount of energy will have gone into building that, making its materials, transporting them, and putting them up, and so forth. And one of the things you have to balance when you're thinking about sustainability is if you like, the kind of waste of that embodied energy. If you were to demolish a building or remove elements of it and replace them, and you've got to think about the energy that's embodied in the materials that you're going to replace them with. So new materials, particularly concrete, notably concrete, are very kind of energy hungry, carbon hungry, if you like. So yeah, embodied energy is embodied carbon. I often liken it to the kind of analogy of a car and its fuel. Is it the most sustainable thing to do to replace a 10-year-old car with a new energy intensive car just to make a small fuel efficiency saving? And so what you have to do is balance the cost of making the new car with how much fuel it's going to save.
As a good example, Crispin, Perhaps a more historic building-specific example, you could look at stone. If buildings are built out of locally quarried stone, there's relatively, really quite low level of energy use and carbon emitted. Stone, unlike brick, doesn't have to be fired, and if it's local, it has some transport costs, but the whole point of the use of local materials is that there's minimal transport costs. If you then look at a lot of buildings which are built out of reconstructed or artificial stone, now that's usually manufactured in large-scale plants. I've actually been in these plants, and you see that you have to squeeze all compress the material when it's plastic together with the water to the right level. Heavy-duty machinery they use. And then the product, it's probably made in one or two places in the country, is moved all around the country on great lorries. So there's a huge amount of road haulage involved. So comparing the two, the natural stone to the artificial stone, the natural stone is, if used locally, is considerably more energy efficient and in terms of what we're calling embodied energy or embodied carbon. But sadly, the natural stone is usually considerably more expensive than the artificial. So that's what we're really talking about, how much energy's gone into the thing, and these things don't often get properly taken account of when people are in the actual cost or when people are assessing. I mean, a personal example, back in the 1990s, when I was trying to be green, I bought a condensing gas boiler, and I was one of the first people to have one. People saw it pluming and thought, what the hell's that? Steam puthering out the side of the house. And I replaced a back boiler that had been there for about a good 30 years or more. It had never gone wrong. I'd never replaced anything particularly in it, and it just got a bit noisy because it get a bit furred up. But I was told that this highly efficient replacement boiler was going to make me really, really highly sustainable. And had it fitted, it was quite expensive, and from day one it performed really badly. Different components kept failing, and I had to have them repaired. You couldn't get a small electrical component. You had to replace the whole chunk, which always cost 200 or 300 quid. Replacing the pumps, replacing all these pieces of electrical circuitry that went wrong, and it was so bad. I won't risk telling you what the manufacturer was. I don't want to be sued, but it was a terrible thing. I just had to have it taken completely out, and I had to have another condensing boiler. It was the only sensible option. But the amount of energy that went into manufacturing the Duff boiler, and all the replacement of parts, the transport costs associated, and it all went to waste in 5 or 6 years. And it's, to my mind, rather than being a highly efficient, sustainable boiler, it was the complete converse. It was highly unsustainable.
And the key point is that over those 5 or 6 years, that boiler wouldn't have saved the equivalent amount of fuel to make up for all those extra costs, would it?
Battling on with the old one. But these issues of embodied energy or embodied carbon, if you prefer to describe it that way, it rarely gets properly considered. I know it's difficult to physically calculate, but it's always there, and I think it's always got to be looked at in terms of not just historic buildings, but all buildings. A lot of these big reinforced concrete 1960s buildings, they weren't there when I was born. They've not been there that long, and they're often being ripped down, and it's highly unsustainable because you're destroying all that embodied energy, embodied carbon.
Yeah.
It's a good example, right? Because the Ministry of Justice did some research on their estates a number of years ago, and they discovered that the late 20th century buildings they had were the worst performing because their earlier buildings used a lot of natural light and ventilation, and these later buildings were almost entirely on artificial lighting and ventilation and so forth. So your initial instinctive reaction might be, right, okay, well, we need to get rid of all the modern buildings, don't we? But they would have much higher embodied energy. And so actually a more sort of energy efficient, carbon efficient step then would be to say, well, how can we make the later buildings more efficient rather than replacing them and starting with some
adaptation rather than replacement.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Roy, your example there, the boiler, sort of makes me think about the concept of maintenance and repair, and not only with building fabric, but mechanical elements as well. And as technology changes, and how much maintenance and repair to these individual pieces, and is that being factored in? I know in the historic environment, maintenance repair, we talk about this a lot. But what's its impact really, and how important is it when we're talking about sustainability?
Well, maintenance in particular, it never sounds like a very exciting activity. You know, clearing out your gutters and doing repairing broken things, broken components of buildings. But really, it's absolutely fundamental to architectural conservation. William Morris made that point back in the 19th century, and it's as true now as it was then. The old adage, a stitch in time saves 9, it holds absolutely true. And it's always hooked in maintenance and repair, but repair very often that only occurs as a result of neglect when you want to do the seriousness. I mean, obviously there are elements of buildings that are sacrificial. I mean, something like thatch, of course, that's relatively short life, or you've either got to put a new surface on sometimes thatch. Some depends on the material. Sometimes you have to replace the whole lot in relatively short periods compared to brickwork and masonry and tiled roofs and things like that. But by and large, maintenance is the thing that keeps buildings going. Well-maintained buildings can survive in the very long term. So it really couldn't be more important, and it's very much at the heart of sustainability.
Yeah, a lot of repair arises because of poor maintenance. You know, your brickwork wouldn't be spalling due to the frost if you'd repaired your gutters and the brickwork wasn't wet to start with. And that's I suppose the kind of key element. It's mainly to do with water in particular, and also maybe drafts. But yeah, if buildings, if particularly solid wall buildings, if they become damp, that makes them less comfortable, and it makes them less thermally efficient, which then leads to people consuming more energy to keep them comfortable. So if you don't repair and maintain those walls, you can invest an awful lot of money in an expensive heating system, which will be largely wasted because thermal efficiency doesn't necessarily equate to thermal comfort in particular, which is much more dependent on relative humidity and the kind of variation of surface temperatures within a room. So it's no good having cold walls and really efficient windows, because that will still be an uncomfortable room to live in.
Stepping back a second and sort of looking at the bigger picture, you know, the Ihbc is the home of the conservation professional, as we say, a sort of broad tenor organization, architects, planners, surveyors, engineers, archaeologists, all sort of included. So how does the conservation professional go about balancing these resource expenditures, carbon impact to heritage or historic significance? I guess we'll start with Roy, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's actually quite a difficult question, but it's at the heart of what conservation professionals have got to do. It is all about balance. You know, technically, you can upgrade any building. Historic buildings could be made to perform to very high levels of thermal efficiency, etc. But it's a question of what it is appropriate and sensible to do. And I think the starting point you've got to is that conservation it's a component of sustainable development. It is the you take back and look at the bigger picture. If you were to simply so prioritize sort of thermal efficiency or whatever on say a listed building, you could potentially destroy what is significant about it, what makes it worthy of being a listed building. You could potentially destroy its character, its appearance, and its significance. So you've got to strike balances, and that will always be different for each building. You know, as I said, in answer to an earlier question, these buildings have got to play their part, but you've got a danger that you could actually throw the baby out with the bathwater, and you could spoil the thing you're trying to conserve. And conservation of the environment is part of sustainable development. The government's lead policy document, the National Planning Policy Framework, you know, it makes it clear that to be sustainable development, you have to comply with all the chapters of that document. And one of those chapters is about conserving the historic built environment. So if you actually carried out works that were so harmful that they destroy the significance of the building you're trying to conserve, you haven't carried out sustainable development. You've got to strike a balance. It doesn't quite answer your question, because you were asking how do you do that, but I think the answer is that it's going to be different in each and every case. You've got to balance the harm against the benefit, and that's really got to be a judgment made by competent, well-informed professionals. So it basically means that people that call themselves conservation professionals, or whether they're architects, planners, whatever they are, if they're involved in making these decisions, they've got to understand what they're dealing with. Informed conservation, as it was termed a few years ago, understanding the significance, what is it that's significant about the building or the place you're dealing with, and how will that be harmed by the intervention. You've got to strike the balance, but you've got to have adequate knowledge of the green issues, and you've got to have adequate knowledge of the heritage issues, and you've got to strike the appropriate balance.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that we're not talking about a niche interest here. Heritage provides really important components of a huge majority of people's well-being. Numbers well into the 80s and 90% of people who derive enjoyment from the historic environment, and that enjoyment is important to their mental health, and you know, it's where they go to relax and that kind of thing. So you know, we're not just talking about kind of a very sort of specialist interest. Yes, conservationists can end up in kind of very detailed discussions about what's significant about a particular place. But the overall importance is, and the National Planning Policy Framework recognises this, is about what future we are conserving for people. So while it's easy perhaps to say, well, the only important thing is preserving the planet. Yeah, that's true. But we also have to think about where we're going to live and what it's like in the future. And you know, it's universally recognised that the heritage is an important part of giving people a sense of well-being. So it's what do we preserve and how do we preserve it so that what's special about it is retained. Because it's not just a question of saying, no, you can't change anything about it. That's not what conservation is about.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because well, it's such an interesting stat about how many people respect the historic environment and take enjoyment out of it. But often, you know, I see sort of a public perception problem, as much as oftentimes conservation officers, planning departments are seen as obstructionists and sort of resisting change. So, you know, how do you go about thinking about that? How do you see the role of the planning system and sort of meeting this challenge of climate change, and how do we go about educating the public about what this role is?
Yeah, it's an interesting perception. I mean, it's not accurate in the vast majority of planning applications. Unlisted building consent applications are approved, and there are two reasons mainly, I think, why conservation people may say no. One may be that there has been a kind of lack of investment in conservation professionals over the last 10-15 years. So you may have people who are inexperienced and therefore a bit over precautionary. But the other the other sort of main reason is because they've been faced with ill thought out proposals. It's that the people making the proposals don't have the right training and specialist understanding, and that's something that that also has to be addressed, because unless you properly understand what's important about what you're dealing with, the building or place that you're making an application related to, you're not going to develop appropriate proposals for it.
Yeah, I think as well, we've got to recognise that the planning systems are absolutely key to securing a sustainable future. The system, it shapes where people live, where they work, where they play, how people move around in between places. So the buildings people use, the means of transport they employ, they've got to be made highly efficient to minimise carbon emissions. And the critical thing in relation to heritage, that heritage controls have always been part of British planning law, right from the start of the comprehensive planning system. Heritage conservation is incorporated, and as a result, it's incorporated into the reshaping of our towns and cities to make them more sustainable. So it can only be done by looking at things in an integrated way. And I think in relation to that, something that we mentioned earlier, this Ihbc position statement, that statement does recognise that heritage is not just about listed buildings or even conservation areas. The idea of the historic environment it covers all heritage features. For example, historic landscapes, parks and gardens, historic canals and waterways, that sort of thing. And as Crispin's just been saying, the contribution they make to the quality of life and the people's well-being is monumental. So you have to say no to protect these things. It just goes with the territory. It makes people get accused of being negative, but sometimes you have to be negative to protect, and that is in itself a positive thing. It's very important that the planning system sees the bigger picture, and it's just not got this sort of blinkered approach. We've got to improve heat loss through windows, so we've got to start sticking plastic windows in all the listed buildings or whatever. You don't take this myopic view. You've got to take the holistic, the comprehensive, holistic view.
Yeah, and it seems that if the planning system is taking that sort of holistic, integrated approach, it's a bit odd that so many of the policies we've seen come out on this subject tend to be more sort of individual building focused. Would you say that how do you design a good policy, or what does a good policy look like that sort of takes this integrated approach?
Well, as I just mentioned, the Ihbc's position statement gives as much prominence to historic places, the bigger picture stuff, as it does to historic buildings. So living in a highly energy efficient house and at the same time having a 100-mile round trip commute to work isn't going to secure a sustainable future. You have to look at that bigger picture, and it goes beyond conservation and planning controls. The fact of the matter is, if we are going to achieve a sustainable future, people are going to have to change their behaviours. That's very much part of it, and changing behaviours is part of taking a comprehensive, holistic look at the problem. It's the same thing installing a high level of insulation and an expensive, high efficient heating system, ground source, heat pump or whatever, and you stick that into a drafted building. You're not going to provide a carbon neutral home, are you? You've got to take the holistic approach.
No, you're right, Roy, and yeah, it's very important to think about places. The vast majority of the historic environment isn't designated. Listed buildings, even area designations like conservation areas and registered parks and gardens and so forth, cover a tiny percentage of what's out there. People often don't understand perhaps until it's threatened. But just for example, kind of what you might consider ordinary terraced streets, 19th century housing, often have lots of nice decorative detail, not worthy of designation necessarily, and perhaps a little bit too kind of altered by later development to be worthy of a conservation area designation. But nonetheless, that's a really important part of what people sit and look at or walk past every day. And also, those are buildings which physically function in a different way from modern buildings as well. So you have to treat them differently from modern buildings. So that kind of recognition that the historic environment is all around us doesn't mean that everything has to be preserved the way it is, but it does mean that these issues need to be thought of much more often than just when you're dealing with designated assets listed buildings.
And speaking of thinking about these more often, you mentioned earlier we've been underinvesting in sort of conservation professionals over the last 10 to 15 years. So you look at guidance on the subject. There's a lot of it, but it's some of it's expensive or sort of disparate. How do you think we go about ensuring that practitioners working on historic and traditional buildings have the requisite skills and competencies?
Yeah, that's really important. I think it starts with recognizing who those practitioners are. Because of the kind of ubiquity of the historic environment, you're talking about, jobbing builders spend a lot of their time working on traditional buildings. Well over half of building work is on existing buildings, things like extensions and repairs and improvements. And around about a third of the UK building stock is of traditional construction, so solid walled or very narrow cavity walls. That kind of construction continued well after the First World War. So a lot of people who wouldn't consider themselves to be the owner of a historic building actually do live in these buildings and work on them. So I think there's a huge amount to be done in terms of the training in the building industry, which until very recently has been almost entirely focused on new methods of construction and has paid very little attention to how most of or a large proportion of the existing buildings were built and how they function, which is different. They're much more reliant on the sort of gradual absorption and then evaporation of moisture. They're much more reliant on ventilation, natural ventilation, than modern buildings are. And so it's really important that we don't just focus on making sure that more conservation officers get trained or anything like that. It's got to be integrated into the mainstream of people's thoughts and people's training.
Yeah, I think it's in actual fact there's no shortage of guidance material. If you've got a computer, within minutes you can find all sorts of guides and documents and details for all manner of things to do with insulation and heating and all the rest of it, all the issues. But in actual fact, there's so much that it actually gets confusing. And I think that there is a big need for people to be trained. Certainly one of the failings of a lot of the guidance that is out there is a failure to recognise that traditional buildings perform differently to modern buildings. Traditional buildings generally have permeable roofs and walls, and they handle moisture and water and water vapour form differently to modern buildings, which by and large are designed with an impermeable envelope. And you tend to find that the guidance offers a sort of one-size-fits-all solution, which often it can be appropriate for the modern buildings, but not the traditional buildings. So there's a definite need for training. And I think the IHB needs to play its part in upskilling members and potential members with CPD offers in this area, because there's clearly a need for it.
All right. Well, thank you both very much for joining us. That was a great conversation, and I guess I'd like to wrap up by asking you both, in your estimation, what does the future look like, or what should it look like in terms of sustainability and conservation of the built environment?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I'd like to hope that we could, we can meet this challenge that's in front of us and think, I'd like to think that in sort of 20, 30, 40 years, we're largely, the majority of us are living in towns and cities. They're livable, walkable. Most people are able to walk and cycle safely. And those places will be incorporate a lot of the buildings that currently exist, historic buildings, and the places, the gardens. We won't have sacrificed our great parks and gardens. Our canals and rivers will still be cherished, and people will be enjoying them. And we won't have thrown the baby out with the bathwater in terms of trying to upgrade everything, come what may, without having regard to its architectural and heritage character, appearance, and significance.
Yeah, I think that's a really good vision, Roy. I think I'd like to see definitely a kind of return of the use of some of the more traditional materials, and potentially, well, like you say, I think hopefully the retention of an awful lot of what's great about the historic environment we have today. I really hope that the successful operation of heritage-led regeneration, which has been hugely successful over the last 30 years or more, that's something that has continued, and I'm quite hopeful about that. Historic England's particularly done a lot of research on, for example, the potential for historic mills, particularly in the north, to contribute to climate change mitigation and things like housing supply and so forth. And I really hope that becomes, again, more of a kind of mainstream model, and not just something that's done when there's a pesky listed mill that has to be kept. This is something that's applied to undesignated heritage as well.
And let's hope that these old buildings, that the people that deal with them can adapt them sensitively and make them perform more efficiently. But the adaptations and conversions, etc., are done with sensitivity for heritage significance.